Hi, welcome to the first mini lecture on the conceptualization of later life sex. This is really just the basics, an overview of a lot of different things that we're going to go over in more detail. This is a overview of the information from my article that you're reading for the week, as well as the information that's from the Lindau et al. Article that gives a lot of the numbers of older adult sexuality, how much is going on, what types are going on, the dysfunction, etc. So those couple of articles are really going to be highlighted here. And you will also be reading them on your own. So let's see. First of all, we're going to define the concepts or conceptualize sexuality and aging. So first of all, what do we mean by sex? Because there are a lot of different definitions or ways that people conventionally think about it. Like if you were describing it to a friend versus you were describing it in an academic paper. So for sexuality, traditionally, the biomedical model of sexuality has defined it predominantly as sexual functioning, physical functioning. So it's definitely categorized in terms of dysfunction or function. So what types of things are functioning well biologically and what types of things aren't functioning well biologically. So when we talk about biologically, this is from Masters and Johnson, who, if you've ever seen that show on Showtime, Masters of Sex, that was about them, but they're basically the father and mother of sexual medicine or science. And they define sexuality primarily in terms of biological functioning. And this diagram here is how they explain the sexual response cycle, or what happens biologically in sex. So there's both time across and the amount of arousal on the left axis. So when you're looking at the biological sexual experience, there's first a stage of excitement that sort of increases as your arousal is increasing, and then there's a physiological time of plateau where things are kind of working and moving up towards that climax or orgasm, which is that physiological experience, and then release and a resolution period, which is when your body is resting or recovering from the sexual experience. So this is the biological sexual response that defines the traditional model of sexuality. So that's pretty much what sex was looked at as. It's very outcome or performance focused when we look at this, right? So it's about, did you go from point A to point B and go through all of the physical responses that you were supposed to? And the outcome is orgasm. And it definitely is limited into intercourse-related behaviors. So as you can see in the sexual response cycle, it's all about penile and vaginal intercourse. So there are all kinds of other types of sexual behaviors, but the traditional biomedical model of sex is all about that one behavior. Which, as we'll talk about later, is also heteronormative, or that means it's centered on men and women relationships, right? The traditional model of sex was also very current and youth focused. So what's going on with me now? What are my problems now? Not sort of this sexual history of my life and how I got to the point where I was. And it definitely has a youth perspective on functioning and health. So what do we want to move towards instead? If we aren't big fans of this biomedical model, what do we want instead? Well, feminist sex therapists for a long time have been criticizing the biomedical model because it creates what they consider a charmed circle, or the people who are in and who can do the things that you're talking about, and the people who are out and don't make sense. I mentioned previously heteronormative, also youth. So it was very much privileged. So sexuality includes a lot more than just the traditional model. It's more than biological. It's biological, psychological, and social, which is the biopsychosocial model as opposed to the biomedical model. That is described in depth in the Della Mater and Sill article, and you can read more about that as well as see the next lecture. We also want to move towards categorizing things in terms of wellness instead of dysfunction. So dysfunction or functioning, biological sexual functioning, is only one little bit of what is a holistic wellness experience. Can certainly be sexually well without at the same time as having sexual dysfunction. So we don't want to limit ourselves to just, does it function or not, but am I well in general? Am I having experiences that I'm happy with? We also want to move away from just this outcome performance based to a process focus, or about the process of the experience and the pleasure of the experience, not just did I have an orgasm or did I not, but what was the process like, what was enjoyable, what wasn't, and what can be enhanced. In the new model, the biopsychosocial model, we also wanted to move more towards a spectrum of behaviors. So I mentioned that it was very limited to just intercourse and specific type of intercourse. But as we all know, there's many different behaviors that are involved. And for older adults, that's particularly important, as I'll talk about later, that the form of sexuality or the type of activities that you do tends to change over your lifespan. You remain interested for a long time and continue to do things, but some of the things that you do will change. And that might be based on preference, your physical health, availability of someone else, all of those types of things. But we want to make sure that we're being inclusive of all kinds of behaviors. We really want to move away from just how I'm doing currently to defining my sexuality and a more youth perspective to this across the lifespan. What is my history? What do I bring with me? What experiences have shaped my sexual past, influences my current sexuality, and what I will want for the future. And we want to make sure we're doing that, as well as appreciating the fact that sex happens across the lifespan. It's not just a one time in life and then nobody else gets to do it. So really, what we're trying to mean by sex is moving towards a breadth, as you can see at the bottom, and a depth. So both a lot of things and a depth of those things, and not just the surface or one area like biological functioning. So one model or one organization who's achieved that is the WHO, or the World Health Organization. A few years back, they defined sexual health very broadly. And I'm just going to read this out to you, but this graph is a picture of all of the things that they think are important to be sexually healthy. And as you can see, there's much more than just biological function and dysfunction. They state that sexual health is a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being related to sexuality. It is not merely the absence of disease, as a biomedical model would say, dysfunction or infirmity. Sexual health requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences, being free of coercion, being free of discrimination and violence. For sexual health to be attained and maintained, the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. So in that, you can see a lot of different concepts that span into the biological form or the physical form, our social interactions with others with respect and dignity and safety, as well as psychological aspects like being free of discrimination and it being relational and having sexually empowering experiences, and taking into account cultural issues like gendered norms and power dynamics in sex. So it's about a bunch of different things that you can see, much more than just is the plumbing working. Okay, so that's a bit about the definition or conceptualization of sex in aging. Let's explore a little bit more to understand some of the basics. As far as the numbers game, and this comes primarily from the Lindau et al. Article, the many older adults are engaging in a lot of different types of sexual behaviors across the lifespan. So you'll see that in the Lindau article. Prevalence data, which means how much is happening, in large cross-sectional studies shows that older adults are engaging in sexual activity and experiencing associated benefits from that. For instance, about 73% of those who were 57 to 64 in the Lindau study were engaging in sexual activity over the past year. And of those who were active in this next range up, the 65 to 74-year-olds, 65% of men and women reported that they were doing it frequently, 2 to 3 times per month. So there are a number of older adults still engaging in sexual activities and frequent sexual activities. And as you can see in the next point, frequency of sex doesn't tend to change that much over time, up until about age 75. Then we see a little bit more decline in the frequency of sexual activity, and we also see a change in the types of activities that you do. So what's making that different after 75? Some of the stuff that makes it different up to 75 still, but especially things like physical or emotional health problems. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the biological and the psychological side. So things like heart disease and depression are going to affect your sexual life. In more chronic diseases that you have in those older ages, the more likely it is to affect your sexual life. Also, a big one, especially for older women, is not having a partner. So you've seen probably the demographics about the population aging, and you know that women live longer than men. So after their male partners are deceased, a lot of times women stop engaging in sexual activity because they just don't have an available partner. Some of them lose interest as well, but the interest is there for some. It's just that they don't have opportunity. All right. Also, sexuality, as I mentioned, changes a little bit in activity. So we call what you do during sex a sexual script. So that script changes quite a bit as you age, and over time you add things, you subtract things, you find things that you like, and sort of defines that beginning, middle, and end of what you do during sex. For old adults, which are those sort of above that 74-year-old range, the activities tend to shift more towards intimacy types, hugging, kissing, touching, things that may be substituted, intimate behaviors that might be more substituted if you are having more problems with having intercourse. And I just wanted to show you this graphic, which shows you the percentages of older adults in different age groups and genders reporting different types of behavior. So a lot of times I like to challenge students to think about the fact that older adults are having sexual relations and expressing intimate activities, but they're doing a lot of different things, right? So we don't have the corner market on being novel in sexuality. That happens across the lifespan. People who are having solo sexual experiences, oral sex, anal sex, penile vaginal intercourse, they're all happening, just at different rates. And you're probably adding, subtracting different activities across your lifespan. All right. So another thing about aging sexuality is that it doesn't lose its importance. Up into the oldest ages, sexual intercourse or sexual desire may decrease. That's part of physiological functioning and connected a lot to hormones, and we'll talk about that in the biological portion. But psychological importance, like this is an important aspect to my life, or I think that sexuality and intimacy are important to me, doesn't change all that much as we age. It remains important to older adults, and the majority of them. Sexuality is an important part of their life, important part of their relationships. In fact, 65% of older adults reported it as critical to their relationships, and a high number report that it's important to successful aging. This was in an AARP study done in 2010, looking at sexual behaviors and attitudes and beliefs. So you can see here from the graph, and I'll try to move my picture there. So these are older adults reporting that sex is an integral part of quality of life, or a key part of their quality of life. You can see that 81% of older men, 61% of older women think that sex is an integral part of their quality of life. So this is just illustrating that it's very important to us across our lifespan. Sex is also important because we have benefits from it. Psychologically and physically, we get benefits from engaging in intimate and sexual behaviors. Some of those benefits that still remain across the lifespan are things like lowering your cardiovascular incidence and risk, increased relaxation, decreased pain sensitivity. So when you think about those things, those are the typical things we get from exercise. And sex, if nothing else, is an exercise activity. So those things make sense. We also get emotional benefits from sex. It has been shown to increase overall happiness, decrease levels of depression, increase overall psychological well-being or your mental health, your overall quality of life, and increase your self-esteem. So those are all kinds of benefits that have been reported specifically for older adults as well, that we want to make sure that we're empowering people to capture into older ages. Okay. So the other side of the coin about sexuality is that functioning side, or the health side. About 1 in every 2 older adults or half experience one or more sexual concerns. So that's on the dysfunction side of the biomedical model, or the dysfunction side of the biological part of the biopsychosocial model. So you can see here some of the stats, and I'll zoom in on this, but there are different types of sexual concerns that older adults might experience. And when we think about gender, there are some that women are more likely to experience than men. So for women, we see a lot of sexual pain, problems with vaginal lubrication. So as your hormones change, that affects if you lubricate or not, which can be very painful during sex if you're not using external help. You also see increases in the inability to climax and avoiding sex due to some of these problems, as well as some psychological problems that we'll talk about later. For older men, most commonly, they're going to experience erectile dysfunction, which is related to blood flow, right? So heart disease, a lot of those factors and chronic diseases are going to affect your blood flow, which affects your ability to maintain or get an erection. So that's one of the most common concerns, but they also have reductions in sexual desire, like women, and that's, again, tied to hormones, which we'll talk about, and the biological part as well. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on that so that you can see some of the numbers, and those are percentages. So for instance, if you look at the first line, that's 57 to 64-year-old males, 30.7% of them report some type of erectile dysfunction. And you can see that these typically go up across ages, but some of them don't shift very much. As we get into the younger olds, which are 57 to 64, the middle olds, which is up to 65 to 74, and then oldest olds, which is 75 plus. When we talk about sexual health, we can't forget sexual risk. So it's not just dysfunction, but also disease. So sexually transmitted infections is one of those areas that is kind of blossoming in older adulthood, as we see a lot of large retirement communities and a lack of sex education and sexual protection. We tend to see increased risk. So if you didn't think that older adults were engaging in sexually risky behaviors, or if you thought that, then you are mistaken. There is a lot of sexual risk that actually happens and is reported by older adults. It may not always, result in a sexually transmitted infection, but it can. And those rates tend to be increasing. So when we look at national rates of HIV and syphilis, particularly chlamydia, those types of sexually transmitted infections, they're increasing at a pretty high rate for older adults. That doesn't mean that the majority of older adults have an STI. That just means that more and more older adults over time are getting sexually transmitted infections or reported. So that's something we need to keep track of and think about, as it's important to address sexuality and aging because older adults not only enjoy it, get benefits from sex, but they also are introduced to risk and some concerns that we need to think about and address as a healthcare profession. All right, so that is my basic overview of some of the main areas of older adult sexuality. So we talked about defining and some of the numbers, or we explored some of the numbers. And some of the conclusions that we can take from this is that a holistic or biopsychosocial model of sexuality is something that we need in order to accurately represent sexual expression across the lifespan. As I mentioned, if we're only looking at what's wrong and the biological functioning side, we're missing a huge portion of the picture of sexuality, especially since things like sexual activities change away from intercourse, which is a big focus of the biomedical model, and move towards different activities, become more intimate in nature, and are about those psychological and social issues as well. Also, one of the things to note from this is that sex is happening across the lifespan, right? So we saw the numbers there, it's happening, it's out there. And we need to understand how the barriers or challenges to that, but also how we can support that across the lifespan. There is no expiration date. Each individual person decides when they want to stop doing certain activities. It's not that after age 65, it's all over. Which brings me to the last conclusion here that I'm going to talk about more and more across the semester. So a lot of times when we think about sex, whether we do it on purpose or not, we think about it cross-sectionally. So what I mean by that is that I'm in my 30s. So I think, well, I'm in my 30s and I'm like this. And that guy over there is in his 60s, so he's like that. So we compare ourselves to another age group of people instead of thinking, well, I'm in my 30s and this is how my sexual experiences are going now. And when I'm in my 60s, this might be how they are and how can I prevent or support that. And that is more of a longitudinal perspective, right? Me versus me over time, as opposed to me versus them. So it's not about a cross-sectional younger versus older. It's about thinking about sexuality as something that starts when you're born and continues with you as you age, a longitudinal journey. And that's what I want us to do this semester, is think about sex longitudinally as opposed to that us versus them. This is how sex is when you're 30, but that's how it is for them when they're 60. Everybody's going to be 60 and 70 if you're lucky. So that's why it's important to think about it longitudinally. All right, so that's it for this time. And next up, you'll hear my mini lecture on the biopsychosocial model versus the biomedical model, which we really talk about a lot in the Della Mater and Sill article. So I'll see you then.